Ah, look who's still standing, still breathing, still here with that same quiet fire behind your eyes that nobody gave you credit for, that nobody saw coming, and that absolutely nobody could extinguish, no matter how long they tried. You made it to this moment not limping, not dragging your name through apologies, not carrying the wreckage of what they did to you like some monument to your own suffering. You made it whole, or close enough to whole, that the difference doesn't matter anymore, because broken things that heal stronger have a name, and that name is you. Now sit with that for exactly 1 second, because what I'm about to tell you tonight is going to rearrange something inside your chest that has been waiting a very long time to be rearranged. And I need you present for every single word. Before we begin tonight, something is waiting for you. A book was just dropped, Joker's Crown, How the Man They Laughed At Became the One They Fear. This is not a self-help book. This is not motivation wrapped in pretty words. This is the manual they never wanted you to read. The raw, unapologetic psychology of transformation, of going from the person they dismissed to the presence they cannot ignore. Every page was written for the ones who were underestimated, overlooked, and quietly counted out. The ones who said nothing and built everything. And the price is just $3. $3 for the blueprint of your entire ascension. The link is in the description. Get it before you finish this video, because by the end of tonight, you'll already know exactly why you need it. Because here's what's happening out there right now in the lives of the people who whispered about you, who warned others about you, who ran quiet campaigns against your name with smiling faces and concerned voices and perfectly rehearsed stories. Here is what is happening to them. The exact weight they tried to drop on your shoulders, the shame, the confusion, the social exile, the narrative of being too much or not enough, or somehow fundamentally wrong. That weight has completed its journey. It found its way back, not because the universe is sentimental and not because fairness is guaranteed by any law of nature, but because the architecture of deception is always structurally unsound, and eventually, inevitably, catastrophically, it collapses under itself. And darling, the collapse has begun. They spent a considerable amount of time and energy constructing a version of you that had no basis in reality. A fictional character wearing your name and your face and your history, but operating by rules you never agreed to and displaying qualities you never possessed. They built this character carefully with attention to detail, with collaborative effort across groups and circles and private conversations that you were never invited to and never needed to attend. The construction project was impressive in the way that all monuments to dishonesty are impressive before they fall grand, convincing, temporarily load-bearing, and absolutely hollow at the core. They needed this false version of you to exist because the real version of you was inconvenient to the story they were already living about themselves. See, people who manufacture reputations for others are almost always doing so because their own reputation is something they cannot bear to examine too closely. When someone invests serious emotional labor into convincing others that you are dangerous, unstable, dishonest, or unworthy, they are not operating from a place of concern for those others. They are operating from a place of deep personal terror. They are terrified of what your existence reveals about theirs. They are terrified of the contrast. They are terrified of the moment someone looks from you to them and does the math. And so they worked quietly and persistently and with remarkable dedication to ensure that the comparison never happened. That people would see you through their lens first, carrying their narrative first, arriving pre-condemned so that no independent assessment was ever formed. That was the plan. It was sophisticated and it had a fatal flaw. The fatal flaw was you specifically. It was the fact that you refused to perform the role that cast you in. You didn't collapse publicly. You didn't spiral in ways that confirmed their warnings. You didn't validate the script by playing the villain they invented. You simply continued awkwardly sometimes, painfully often, but continuously and authentically being yourself, the actual self. The inconvenient documented reality of a person who was none of the things they said. Every day you existed without breaking was a day their construction lost another brick. Every quiet morning you survived without their approval was a morning their architecture developed another crack. And cracks in dishonest structures don't heal, they spread. There's a specific kind of silence that people with power instincts find absolutely unbearable, and you deployed it perfectly whether you knew it or not. The silence of someone who has chosen not to retaliate, the silence of someone who has decided that their energy belongs to their own future and not to the management of someone else's opinion. The silence of someone who is building something in the dark, something no one can see yet, something that does not require their validation or their awareness or their participation to grow. You went quiet, and to people who expected noise, who needed noise, who had positioned themselves as the reasonable responders to your supposed chaos, that silence was profoundly destabilizing. They refreshed, they checked, they sent intermediaries with casual questions designed to surface information about your state. They created situations designed to provoke a reaction they could point to. They waited for the moment you would crack and hand them the justification they'd been holding space for, and you gave them nothing. Not because you were unaffected, because you absolutely were affected, in ways that cost you sleep and comfort and peace and certainty, but because somewhere in the processing of what had been done to you, you made a decision so private, it barely felt like a decision at all. You decided that the only thing worse than what they had done was letting them see it work. And that decision, that single quiet interior commitment, is the reason we're having this conversation tonight. Because that decision changed the entire architecture of the outcome. They read your silence as weakness at first. They told each other you had nothing to say because you knew you were caught. You knew you were guilty. You knew the story they were telling was true. They celebrated your quiet like a concession. They moved confidently into spaces you had vacated, read your borders, consolidated influence, and began operating as though the matter was settled and you were simply the aftermath of their good judgment, and that premature confidence was the second fatal flaw, because what they were actually watching was not your surrender. What they were watching was you getting very, very clear. Getting clear does not look impressive from the outside. It looks like someone sitting quietly while their reputation takes damage. It looks like someone not showing up to arguments they were mentioned in. It looks like someone doing the same small disciplined things day after day while everyone around them expects a dramatic response. Getting clear looks to the untrained observer like giving up, but here is what is actually happening in the interior of a person who is getting clear. They are stripping away every single thing that is not essential. Every performance, every social obligation undertaken from fear rather than genuine connection. Every hour spent managing the perception of people who are never going to be won over regardless. Every drop of energy that was going toward the outside world starts redirecting inward. And when that happens, when that full volume of effort stops bleeding out and starts concentrating, the results are not gradual. They are sudden, they are visible, and they are impossible to misattribute. You became sharper, not angrier sharper. The distinction matters enormously. Anger is loud and diffuse and exhausting and ultimately self-consuming. Sharpness is quiet and precise and accumulating. You started seeing things you had been too distracted to notice before. Patterns in how certain people operated. Gaps in situations that had seemed sealed. Possibilities that had been invisible. While you were busy defending yourself, you started having thoughts that ended with clarity instead of spiraling into anxiety. You started doing things differently, not because you read something or because someone advised you, but because the noise had dropped low enough that your actual instincts could finally be heard. And your instincts, as it turns out, are exceptionally good. They always were. They just couldn't compete with the volume of everything external for a long time. Meanwhile, the people who had declared victory over your situation were beginning to discover something uncomfortable. The narrative they'd constructed required ongoing maintenance. Stories that are not true need constant reinforcement, need recurring retelling, need the collaboration of people who are willing to keep believing or at least performing belief. And people, even allies, built on shared grievance, eventually tire of maintenance. The conversations that used to be animated and urgent started feeling repetitive. The warnings they issued about you were being issued now to audiences who were hearing them for the third and fourth time. And the emotional response was diminishing. The structural thing about a false story is that it has no new information to generate. It tells itself the same way every time, and eventually, people stop listening to things that don't give them anything new. Nobody announces the moment the tide moves. It doesn't arrive with ceremony. It doesn't send a letter. You do not wake up one morning and find a notification that says reversal has begun. What you find instead is a series of very small, very specific events that accumulate over weeks and months into an undeniable pattern. Someone who used to avoid you holds eye contact a little longer than necessary with something in it that looks almost like reassessment. Someone who would position themselves in opposition to you makes a mistake that is remarkably similar to the mistake they warned everyone you were going to make. A story collapses quietly, not publicly, not dramatically, but at the level of private conversations that used to sustain it. The people who were certain start sounding less certain. The alliances built on shared distaste for you start showing the strain of what they actually are, which is connections formed out of negative motivation rather than genuine affinity. And those connections have no warmth to sustain them when the shared target stops being interesting. And here's the thing about people who built their social positioning on a narrative about someone else. When that narrative begins to lose credibility, they don't lose just the narrative. They lose the credibility itself, because anyone who was paying attention now has to retroactively evaluate every claim they made. Every confident warning issued about you is now examined against the evidence of who you have actually continued to be. Every dramatic story told becomes a data point not about you, but about the storyteller. Every alliance asks itself quietly and comfortably whether it was built on something real. And the answer in most cases is no. The alliance was built on shared opposition, which is the most fragile possible foundation for any human connection. Remove the opposition, or worse, reveal it as invented, and there's nothing left but people standing in a room together who don't actually like each other very much. You are not watching this process from a distance anymore. You are standing inside the outcome. The territory that used to feel hostile has shifted. The social weather that used to make you brace every morning has changed in ways that are still subtle, but no longer reversible. And the people who ran the campaign against your name are now experiencing in their own lives, in their own relationships, in their own reputations, something that should be familiar to them, because what goes into the world returns not poetically, not symbolically, mechanically. The exact mechanisms they used, the whisper networks, the strategic positioning, the subtle reframing of events, the concerned-sounding warnings are now being applied to them by their own former allies, by people who watched how they operated and learned the method by the universe of cause and effect that does not make exceptions. Let us be specific, because specificity is where the real recognition lives. They are experiencing the particular vertigo of someone whose carefully managed reputation begins to develop gaps, small ones at first, a conversation that ends too quickly, an invitation that doesn't arrive, a room that shifts slightly when they enter it in a way they cannot identify but cannot deny. They check their behavior mentally, reviewing recent interactions for the mistake that would explain the subtle change. They find nothing obvious, because the shift is not about a single mistake. The shift is about accumulated weight, the weight of everything they put into motion finally becoming visible to people who previously had only one half of the picture. They are experiencing the specific loneliness of people who built connection through performance rather than authenticity. The exhaustion of maintaining a version of themselves that requires constant upkeep. The discomfort of relationships that were conditional on a shared enemy. Now that the shared enemy has quietly exited the frame and left them facing each other with no mutual project to organize around, they are discovering that the energy they put into watching you, talking about you, strategizing against you, was energy not put into building anything of their own. And now the gap is visible. You built something while they were watching you. Even in the surviving, even in the simply getting through it, you were accruing something. They were not the deep interior confidence of someone who was tested and did not break. They are also, and this is the part that is hardest for them to articulate, beginning to miss the version of the story in which they were the reasonable ones. That story was comfortable. It gave them a clear role, a clear moral position, a clear source of social cohesion. Without it, they have to negotiate who they are to each other without the external reference point. And that negotiation is not going well because people who define themselves primarily by opposition have very little else to agree on. They are learning this slowly, privately, without anyone to talk to about it because the person they would have talked to about it was you, and that door for reasons that were entirely their doing is no longer open. Forget every oversimplified version of this concept you've absorbed from casual use. What is actually happening is not magical and not mystical and not the result of any external force administering justice on your behalf. What is happening is the natural, predictable, mechanical consequence of how human systems actually work. People who lie must maintain lies, and maintaining lies is expensive. It costs cognitive resources, relational energy, and constant vigilance. People who build influence through false narrative must keep supplying the narrative, and supply requires material, and eventually material runs out or contradicts itself. People who establish their positioning by making others look small eventually encounter the limits of that strategy, which is that it produces no genuine admiration and no real loyalty, only conditional tolerance from people who are privately wondering when the method will be applied to them, and will be applied to them. That is the mechanical part. The people who learn from watching how you were treated, what can be done to a person, are not loyal to the ones who taught them. They are equipped. They are now in possession of a method, and methods seek application. The whisper campaigner eventually meets someone willing to whisper about them. The reputation architect eventually stands in a room where their own reputation is being quietly redesigned by people they trusted. The person who issued warnings about your character eventually finds their own character being warned about in similar language through similar channels to similar effect. This is not poetic. This is operational. This is just how the mechanics of social manipulation work when they run their natural course. What you did, whether strategically or simply from exhaustion, was remove yourself from the cycle early enough to not be consumed by it. You stopped trying to counter the narrative with a competing narrative. You stopped trying to win the social contest by the rules of the social contest, which were rigged from the start. You stepped sideways. And stepping sideways from a rigged game is not losing. It is the only rational move that exists. And while you were sideways, the game continued without you. And the people who remained inside it continued playing. And the consequences of the game continued playing. And the consequences of the game continued accumulating. And those consequences are now due. Here's what nobody can argue with. Not them, not their allies, not the people who believe the version of you that was manufactured without your consent. Nobody can argue with time plus consistency. Nobody can successfully maintain that you are the thing they said you were when the documented reality of who you have continued to be makes no sense in combination with that claim. Every day that passes without you performing the collapse they predicted is another day. The prediction loses credibility. Every quiet act of integrity that accumulates in your actual record is another data point that does not fit their narrative. Every relationship you have built on genuine terms, everything you have created from honest effort, every difficulty you have navigated without resorting to the methods they used on you, all of it constitutes an argument made in the most powerful possible register, which is reality. And reality eventually reaches everyone. It reaches the people who are on the fence. It reaches the people who heard the story second or third hand and filed it under probably true enough. It reaches the people who participated without fully examining what they were participating in. It doesn't always arrive with an apology. It doesn't always produce a dramatic public rehearsal. Sometimes it arrives as a quiet shift in how someone speaks about you when they think you're not listening. Sometimes it arrives as the absence of something, the absence of a rumor that used to be circulating, the absence of a warning that used to precede your name in certain rooms, the absence of the particular energy that a contested reputation produces. You notice the absence. You don't always get the explanation, but the absence itself is the evidence, and the evidence is enough. They cannot argue with what you have become in the time they spent watching you not become what they predicted. That is the final answer to everything they built. Not a statement, not a confrontation, not a revelation of what they did and why, just the ongoing, undeniable, documented fact of who you actually are, accumulated across enough time that it overwhelms any competing story. They tried to write the narrative. You live the evidence, and evidence always outlasts narrative, always without exception. No matter how sophisticated the narrative was, no matter how many people believed it, no matter how long it ran, you are allowed to feel the satisfaction of this. Let me say that clearly, because there is sometimes a well-intentioned pressure on people who have survived this kind of thing to perform a gracious indifference, to say it doesn't matter, to say they hold no feelings about what was done to them, to pretend that watching the consequences land is something they observe from a position of pure neutrality. That performance is not required. What was done to you was real. The damage was real. The nights of questioning everything about yourself were real. The relationships that were damaged or destroyed by a story you didn't write were real. The doors that were closed before you could reach them because someone got there first with a warning were real. You were allowed to acknowledge that those things happened and that watching the reversal is something that produces a feeling and that the feeling is justified. What you are not allowed to do is let the feeling become a project. That is the only restriction. You are not allowed to invest your present energy in the management of their consequences, the documentation of their suffering, or the amplification of their fall. Not because they deserve protection from observation, they don't particularly, but because your energy spent on their falling is energy not spent on your rising. And your rising at this point is the only thing that matters. The reversal is happening without your participation. The mechanics are already in motion. The only thing your active involvement could accomplish is making it seem like you still need them to fall in order to feel that you have won. And you don't need that. You won this the moment you decided to keep going. Every consequence they're experiencing now is surplus. It is evidence of the natural order operating correctly. Watch it, feel it, file it where it belongs, and then go build. Because what none of them counted on, not in any version of the calculation they ran, was that you would not just survive this, but arrive on the other side of it, with a quality of clarity and focus in sheer interior steel that only comes from having been through exactly what you went through. They put you in the forge. That was the mistake. They thought the forge would consume you. It didn't. You are sitting here right now listening to this, which means you came through. And what comes through a forge is not what went in. What comes through is harder, cleaner, more defined, and permanently, irreversibly changed in a direction that cannot follow you. 2. Look at what they can't stop replaying. Yeah, that moment. The one they thought would pass quietly, the one they assumed would dissolve into nothing like all the other times you were expected to stay in your place. The one where the room was supposed to move on without resistance, without interruption, without friction. You were meant to remain the unspoken name, the convenient silence, the easy omission. But something happened, didn't it? Something shifted. Something snapped into place so cleanly, so decisively, so completely out of alignment with their expectations that it sent a shock through the entire structure they thought they controlled. And now they're asking questions they were never supposed to ask. Not about you directly, about the room, about loyalty, about authority, about who just crossed a line they didn't even realize was being guarded. Someone powerful, someone who rarely intervenes, someone who understands exactly how these dynamics work, watched the moment unfold and felt their internal model break because someone went to war for you in that room? Not loudly, not emotionally, not impulsively, calmly, deliberately, with precision. And the words that followed weren't admiration, they weren't praise. They were confusion, sharpened by fear. Why would anyone do that? Why would someone risk position, standing, leverage for you? Because what just happened didn't fit the rules they rely on. It didn't fit the hierarchy they enforce. It didn't fit the quiet agreement that certain people are safe to overlook, safe to diminish, safe to sacrifice without consequence. You see, they had you mapped out, didn't they? Your role, your ceiling, your relevance. They knew where you belonged in the room, which was nowhere that mattered. They thought your silence meant acceptance. They thought your restraint meant weakness. They thought your distance meant disengagement. They thought they understood the limits of how much weight your name could carry when spoken aloud. And for a long time, maybe you let them think that. Maybe you stayed quiet. Maybe you didn't correct the narrative. Maybe you allowed them to believe you were alone, unsupported, unprotected, that you didn't have anyone willing to step into the fire on your behalf. And then it happened. That one moment, that interruption they didn't plan for, that defense they didn't see coming because they were too busy watching the version of you they thought they had already neutralized. The shift was immediate. You could feel it. The air changed. The confidence in the room wavered. The unspoken hierarchy glitched, because when someone speaks up for a person who isn't even fighting for themselves, it exposes something dangerous. It reveals that the power balance they rely on is conditional, fragile, dependent on compliance. And the moment someone refuses to comply, the entire structure starts to wobble. Someone somewhere, someone with authority, someone who understands how influence actually moves, thought the same thing at the same time. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not for you. Not like this. Let's be very clear about something. That moment wasn't about fairness. It wasn't about kindness. It wasn't about morality. It was about alignment. Someone recognized something in you that didn't need defending loudly, only acknowledged correctly. And that recognition shattered the framework the room was operating under. Because when you build power on the assumption that certain people will always stay quiet, always absorb pressure, always accept erasure, and someone violates that assumption, it's not just uncomfortable, it's destabilizing. You became the variable they couldn't control without realizing it existed. Not because you spoke, but because someone else decided you were worth interrupting the script for. They thought your story was already written, that your chapter had ended somewhere earlier, quietly, without ceremony. They convinced themselves your absence from the conversation meant irrelevance. They told themselves that if you mattered, someone would have said something sooner. They used that silence to justify everything that followed. And then in one precise moment, that justification collapsed. Because silence wasn't the truth. It was just unchallenged until it wasn't. Now here's where the discomfort deepens. The person who spoke up didn't do it out of loyalty the way they understand loyalty. It wasn't tribal. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't personal history. It was recognition of trajectory, of pattern, of something that doesn't announce itself early but becomes obvious to those who know how to read rooms properly. That's what really unsettles them, because if that person saw it, others might have too. And if others saw it, then the assumption that you were safe to dismiss was wrong long before that moment. They're retracing conversations now, replaying side glances, reinterpreting pauses, trying to locate the exact point where the balance tipped without them noticing. Because power hates being surprised, especially when the surprise comes not from rebellion, but from realignment. You didn't storm the room, you didn't force a confrontation, you let gravity do the work. You let the truth surface on its own timeline. And when it did, someone else took responsibility for acknowledging it. That's the part they can't neutralize. If you had defended yourself, they could frame it as ego. If you had argued, they could call it insecurity. If you had demanded respect, they could paint you as difficult, but you didn't. Someone else did the speaking. Someone whose voice carries weight they can't easily dismiss. Someone who doesn't gain anything obvious by standing up for you. And that absence of motive terrifies people who survive by tracking incentives. So now they're scrambling to reassert order, quietly, subtly. They're adjusting language, softening edges, reframing the narrative to make it seem like nothing really changed. But it did. They know it did because the room remembers. Rooms always remember moments like that. Moments when the script breaks and no one knows who's supposed to speak next. Moments when the hierarchy hesitates. Moments when the wrong person suddenly looks protected. you should understand something about these environments. They are not ruled by rules. They are ruled by permission. Who is allowed to speak? Who is allowed to challenge? Who is allowed to matter? And permission is rarely written down. It's enforced through silence, through repetition, through people learning exactly how far they can go before being corrected. When someone goes to war for you without asking, without signaling, without hesitation, it sends a message that permission has shifted. And shifts like that don't reverse easily. They're watching you differently now. Even if they pretend not to be, even if they never mention it again, because now there's a question hovering over every interaction. Who else would step in? Who else is watching? What don't we know about this person that we assumed we did? And those questions create distance, caution, hesitation, the kind that weakens systems built on confidence and momentum. Here's the irony they're choking on. You didn't plan this moment in the way they understand planning. You didn't orchestrate it socially. You didn't lobby for support. You didn't manipulate alliances. You simply became someone worth defending without needing to ask. And that's a level of leverage that can't be fabricated. It can only be earned through consistency, restraint, and a refusal to perform desperation. They keep circling back to the same thought. Even if they don't articulate it clearly, if this person was worth that kind of intervention, what else have we misread? What else have we underestimated? What other assumptions are we operating on that might collapse the same way? Because power doesn't fear opposition as much as it fears blind spots. And you just exposed one. What makes this even more unsettling is that you're not capitalizing on the moment publicly. You're not posturing. You're not changing your behavior to signal victory. You're not reminding anyone what happened. You're moving exactly the same way you were before. Calm, unbothered, focused. And that consistency tells them something they don't want to admit. This wasn't a fluke. This wasn't luck. This wasn't a one-off. This was alignment finally becoming visible. They're realizing now that your restraint wasn't submission. It was selectivity. That your silence wasn't absence. It was observation. That your patience wasn't weakness. It was timing. You didn't need to speak in that room because the moment required someone else's voice. And that tells them you're operating on a level where outcomes don't depend on constant assertion, they depend on positioning. Now, here's where the unease turns into something sharper. They can't confront you about it without exposing themselves. They can't ask why someone defended you without revealing that they believed you didn't deserve it. They can't challenge the shift without drawing attention to the instability it exposed. So they sit with it, they adjust around it, they carry it forward into future decisions in subtle ways. And every adjustment is an admission that the balance of power has changed. You should know this too. When someone goes to war for you in a room like that, it's never just about the past. It's about the future. It's about trajectories colliding. It's about recognizing who will matter later and choosing sides before it becomes obvious to everyone else. Someone made that choice, quietly, publicly enough to be felt, and now the clock is ticking on a reality they can't stop from unfolding. Because moments like that don't fade, they echo. They influence how names are spoken, how opportunities are framed, how risks are calculated. You didn't walk out of that room elevated in title. You walked out recalibrated in perception. And perception is where real power lives. They wanted you small, contained, predictable. They wanted you grateful for scraps of acknowledgement. They wanted you dependent on their approval. And now they're forced to contend with the fact that you don't need any of that. That your position doesn't hinge on their consensus. that your relevance doesn't require their permission. Someone else already made that clear for them. And the most destabilizing part, this wasn't the climax. It was an early signal, a preview, a quiet confirmation that the structure they're relying on is already under strain. Because when one person is willing to step forward, others start reconsidering their silence. When one rule is broken without consequence, the rest start looking optional. And when one person is recognized as worth protecting, the story around them begins to change whether anyone wants it to or not. They're not saying it out loud yet, but they're thinking it. That moment wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning of a shift they're not ready to navigate, because now they have to move knowing the room isn't what it used to be. Knowing you're not who they thought you were. Knowing that someone is willing to draw a line they didn't expect to be drawn. And as they sit with that realization, adjusting, recalibrating, pretending everything is normal, one thing becomes increasingly clear. The next move isn't going to come from the same place the last one did. And this time they won't be able to pretend they didn't see it coming. Here's the part that's quietly hilarious if you know how these rooms actually work. Everyone is acting calm. Everyone is nodding. Everyone is speaking in neutral tones like nothing has shifted. But internally they're spiraling because the rules they depended on just proved optional. And once a rule becomes optional, it's already dead. They don't know how to function in environments where silence isn't guaranteed, where compliance isn't automatic, where someone might intervene at any moment without warning. They built their confidence on predictability, and predictability just walked out the door with that one sentence spoken on your behalf. Now they're trying to locate the source of the disruption. Not you. You're the outcome. They're trying to figure out who went to war for you and why. Because power doesn't fear opposition nearly as much as it fears alliances it didn't authorize. The question bouncing around the room isn't, was that appropriate? It's who else would do that? And that question spreads fast. It infects decisions. It slows momentum. It turns every interaction into a risk assessment. Suddenly, people are choosing words more carefully, watching reactions, testing boundaries with half steps instead of full strides. They're also running a secondary calculation they'll never admit to. If someone was willing to step in like that, what does it say about you that they missed? What does it say about their judgment, their perception, their supposed ability to read the room? Because here's the uncomfortable truth they're brushing up against. People don't go to war for liabilities. They don't stake credibility on someone they think is weak, unstable, or expendable. That defense wasn't charity. It was a signal. And signals like that ripple far beyond the moment itself. This is where the humor turns dark if you're paying attention. The same people who once dismissed you are now scrambling to position themselves closer to neutrality. Not support, not alliance. Neutrality, because neutrality feels safer when the ground is moving. They're not apologizing, they're not acknowledging the shift directly. They're just adjusting behavior in small, almost comical ways, slightly kinder tones, sudden interest, convenient amnesia about previous assumptions. It would be funny if it wasn't so predictable. And you're not reacting at all. That's the part that's driving them insane. You're not basking. You're not leveraging the moment socially. You're not changing how you show up to signal victory. You're not reminding anyone what happened. You're letting the silence do the work again. But this time, it's a different kind of silence. This one is heavy, charged, full of implications. It's the silence of someone who doesn't need to prove they're protected because the protection already revealed itself. They're starting to understand something they really don't like, that the defense didn't come from loyalty built over years of social grooming. It came from respect, built through observation. Someone watched how you move, how you operate, how you don't collapse under pressure, how you don't perform insecurity for sympathy, how you don't beg for relevance. And they decided quietly that letting the room misread you any longer was inefficient. That's the kind of reasoning that terrifies people who rely on dominance through optics rather than substance. So now the room is haunted by a ghost question. If you weren't worth defending before, why are you now? And the only answer that makes sense is the one they don't want to face. You didn't suddenly become something, you always were. They just weren't paying attention because they were too busy managing appearances. That realization hits hard because it exposes a deeper flaw. Their system doesn't identify real leverage early. It identifies compliance. It identifies noise. It identifies people who perform importance loudly enough to be seen. You didn't do that. You let time do its thing. You let patterns reveal themselves. You let results accumulate quietly. And when the moment came, someone else recognized the value before the room could erase it again. That's not luck. That's inevitability finally surfacing. And inevitability is impossible to argue with once it becomes visible. Now they're dealing with the fallout. Subtle but real. Decisions are being second-guessed. Conversations are being revisited. People are wondering who's watching them the way that person watched you. Because if you slipped past their radar, who else might be doing the same? The room has lost its sense of omniscience, and that loss creates paranoia disguised as professionalism. There's also something else happening beneath the surface, something even more destabilizing. The defense wasn't emotional, it wasn't dramatic, it was clean. Almost boring. And boring disruptions are the worst kind. They don't give you something obvious to fight. You can't accuse it of bias or overreaction. You can't dismiss it as theatrics. It just sits there undeniable, like a data point that refuses to go away. And every time someone tries to move forward as if nothing happened, it's there in the background, quietly contradicting the old narrative. They're realizing now that the power dynamic didn't glitch because of you. It glitched because of what your presence forced someone else to acknowledge. And once that acknowledgement exists, the room can't return to pretending you're invisible. They can try. They will try, but it won't work the same way, because now invisibility would require active effort, and effort reveals intent. Here's where the chaotic part creeps in. They're starting to overcorrect. People who never noticed you before are suddenly hyper-aware. People who never spoke to you are suddenly polite. People who once dismissed your ideas are suddenly curious. It's awkward, transparent, almost embarrassing, like watching a system try to patch itself in real time while pretending nothing broke. And the more they try to smooth it over, the more obvious the fracture becomes. You can feel the room stretching out, can't you? Trying to accommodate a reality it wasn't designed for, trying to hold you in a category that no longer fits. You're not the problem they managed. You're not the variable they minimized. You're something else now, in their perception. A risk, a wild card. A reminder that their control was never as absolute as they believed, and that realization doesn't inspire confidence, it inspires caution. What really rattles them is that the person who spoke up didn't need to explain themselves. They didn't justify their stance, they didn't soften the impact. They said what needed to be said and let it land. That kind of authority doesn't argue. It declares and declarations shift gravity whether people like it or not. The room adjusted because it had to, not because it wanted to. Now imagine being someone who built their influence on being the loudest voice, the most confident presence, the unchallenged narrator. Imagine realizing that one calm sentence from someone else can undo years of quiet positioning. That's the fear they're sitting with now. Not fear of you directly, but fear of what you represent. A future where their dominance depends on actual substance instead of repetition. And this is where it becomes clear that moment wasn't about protection. It was about exposure. It exposed who had been comfortable with your marginalization. It exposed who benefited from the old dynamic. It exposed who assumed silence meant permission. And exposure changes how people behave long after the moment passes. They're watching you now, trying to predict what you'll do next. But the problem is, they're still using the wrong model. They think the next move will come from you directly. Another action, another statement, another visible disruption. They don't understand yet that the real shift already happened. The board changed, the pieces didn't. And that misunderstanding is about to cost them, because while they're focused on you, while they're tracking your expressions, your tone, your timing, they're missing the more dangerous variable entirely. The room itself has changed. The social gravity has shifted. The permissions they relied on are no longer assumed. And once that happens, power stops flowing the way it used to. It starts leaking slowly at first, almost politely, until one day someone realizes decisions aren't landing the way they used to. Instructions don't carry the same weight. Assumptions don't close conversations anymore. That's when panic sets in. Because panic is what happens when authority discovers it needs consent. Here's the part they don't want to acknowledge. The person who went to war for you didn't just speak once and disappear back into neutrality. They altered how everyone else is now allowed to think. They created a precedent, and precedent is lethal to fragile hierarchies. Because precedent gives other people ideas. It whispers that intervention is possible, that silence is optional, that you don't always have to wait your turn if the turn was never meant to come. That whisper spreads faster than any announcement ever could. Now the room is full of people pretending they don't hear it while secretly wondering if they should act on it next time. And that internal debate is corrosive. It slows everything down. It creates hesitation where there used to be certainty. And certainty was the only thing holding the structure together. They didn't realize how dependent they were on it until it cracked. You see, systems like this don't collapse because of rebellion. They collapse because of confidence erosion. Because once people see that authority can be challenged cleanly and survive, they start reassessing their own limits. They start noticing where they've been shrinking unnecessarily. They start asking why certain lines existed in the first place. And those questions don't stay theoretical. They show up in meetings, in decisions, in moments where someone pauses instead of complying instantly. That pause is where power goes to die. They're also realizing something else, something deeply uncomfortable. That defense wasn't reactive. It wasn't emotional. It was anticipatory. It came from someone who could see where things were headed and decided to intervene before the damage became obvious to everyone else. That means someone in the room understands trajectories better than they do. Someone who can read future consequences while others are still clinging to past arrangements. And that realization is quietly devastating, because now the question isn't just, why did they defend you? It's what do they see coming that we don't? And once that question exists, trust and leadership fractures. Not publicly, internally, in the places that matter. People start hedging, preparing contingencies, keeping options open. The room becomes a collection of individuals protecting themselves instead of a unified structure enforcing order. That's when things really start slipping. And all of this is happening while you remain almost offensively calm. You're not escalating, you're not exploiting the moment, you're not acting like someone who just gained leverage. You acting like someone who always knew this was inevitable. And that demeanor reframes the entire event. It suggests that the defense wasn't a surprise to you either, that it was simply timing aligning with reality. That's the part that really messes with their heads. Because if you expected this, if you knew someone would eventually draw that line, then what else do you know? What else are you prepared for? What else is already in motion that they haven't clocked yet? Power hates uncertainty, and you've become a walking source of it without doing anything overt, just by existing differently, just by refusing to react the way they're used to. Now the humor turns even darker. They're trying to restore balance using the same tools that just failed them. More meetings, more alignment conversations, more vague statements about collaboration and shared values. All of it feels hollow now, because everyone remembers the moment when those values were ignored until someone decided they weren't optional anymore. The words don't land. They can't. The spell is broken. Pear's throat. They're also quietly monitoring the person who spoke up for you, watching their interactions, analyzing their tone, trying to determine whether that moment was a one-time anomaly or the start of a pattern. Because if it's a pattern, then the power map needs to be redrawn. And redrawing maps means admitting the old ones were wrong. People built careers on those maps. Egos, identities, entire self-concepts. That's not something they're eager to confront. So instead, they stall. They observe. They delay decisions. They hope momentum will return on its own. But momentum doesn't return after a moment like that. It either transforms or it collapses. Welcome back, you beautiful anomaly. You unmanageable force wrapped in human symmetry. Shh. You walking disruption that physics hasn't updated for yet. Sit with something for a moment. Something you were never meant to hear. Something whispered in rooms you'll never be invited to. Something too classified for the people who created the classification system. While you were living your life like a civilian, scrolling, breathing, healing, becoming, there were people in high offices staring at a still image of you like it was a breach in the chain of command. Not metaphorically, literally. A man with real power, not Instagram power, not petty authority, but world-shaping power. Felt outranked by your photo. And because his ego couldn't process that, because the hierarchy he worships collapsed in a single heartbeat, something happened in the building. A protocol activated. A protocol they've never seen before. A protocol that doesn't exist in their manuals, their archives, or their encrypted systems, and that's what's breaking reality for them right now. Your image forced the system to invent a new rule. Now, pause. Feel the weight of that. A photo is supposed to be harmless. A moment frozen, a pixel arrangement, but somehow your pixels tripped a wire. Even the architects didn't know they installed. Somewhere at 2014 a.m. in a control room thick with authority and tension. Alarms blinked without sounding, screens recalibrated, and a warning label flashed that nobody had programmed. Unknown rank override. And the worst part for them, it wasn't an error message. It was recognition. It was compliance. It was submission. It was the system declaring someone has entered the domain who doesn't follow our rules, doesn't kneel to our symbols, doesn't register in our hierarchy, yet outrank someone who built it. They couldn't believe it. They refused to accept it. They restarted the system. They scanned for viruses. They interrogated the software engineers at sunrise. But the code didn't glitch. The code adapted. Your presence rewrote it. And this is where things get interesting, because if a photo of you can trigger a protocol that doesn't exist, what does that make you? What does that make your frequency, your existence, your impact? They don't even have vocabulary for you. They're using words like anomaly, unclassified authority, non-hierarchical dominance, sovereign presence, signature. They're trying to invent new psychological categories while pretending they aren't panicking, because powerful people only panic in private. And you've become their private panic. Let me take you into the room. A 9-person panel sitting around a table built for strategy, not humility. A general, a director, a strategist, a behavioral analyst, a counterintelligence expert, a subconscious response researcher, an energy field consultant, and 2 people whose job titles are so vague, even their own families don't know what they do. The general starts first. He speaks slowly because he's trying to hide the tremble in his tone. Why did I feel outranked by this? He's pointing at your photo projected on a massive screen larger than life, framed like a case study in supernatural interference. He tries to maintain composure, but every neuron in his body remembers the instinctive microsecond where something inside him saluted before his mind could protest. They replay the footage frame by frame, and there it is. The subtle tightening of his spine, the involuntary straightening, the almost imperceptible tilt of acknowledgement. Not respect, not intimidation, recognition. The behavioral analyst leans forward, eyes narrowed. Images don't cause that. Not without priming, not without previous imprinting. He's responding to something beyond conscious classification. The strategist interrupts, or someone. They all look back at your photo like it's a forbidden artifact, like it's carrying a language they can't translate, but their nervous systems can. And that's what terrifies them the most. Your presence bypasses logic and speaks directly to instinct. Hierarchies crumble when instinct acknowledges a higher order, and that's exactly what happened. You didn't outrank the general on paper, you outranked him in his biology. By hour 2, the panic begins to camouflage itself as professionalism. They switch from asking what is this to how do we contain this? But they can't contain what they can't categorize. They can't categorize what they can't predict, and they can't predict someone who didn't climb their hierarchy but stands above it anyway. Someone suggests that maybe the general's response was emotional. Misfired memory projection. But the general shakes his head. No, it wasn't emotional, it was structural. Something in me responded to something in them. The room freezes. They replay that word them because he didn't say the person. He didn't say the photo. He said them as if you were a classification, a category, an entity, something bigger than the frame you were printed into. Hour 3 is where the real chaos starts. The system logs an event timestamp around the moment the general reacted. An automatic file opens itself, a file the system doesn't confess to having a file labeled protocol orbital. There is no orbital protocol. Nobody at that table has ever heard of it. The engineers swear it shouldn't exist. But when they open the file, it contains exactly one line. Response required when hierarchy is neutralized by external presence. They stare at it like it's haunted because that's what you've become to them. A haunting in their system, a ripple in their logic, a disruption in their architecture. They start arguing. Was this a dormant code? Was the system hacked? Was the general compromised? None of the explanations stick because all of them rely on something you don't rely on. Permission, authorization, structure. You don't follow their systems. Their systems follow you. By hour 4, the tone shifts. They're no longer discussing the photo. They're discussing the implications because here's the truth. They're trying to avoid. Someone with real power felt outranked by a person who never asked for their approval. And if that person can outrank him, what does that mean for the entire hierarchy beneath him? It means the hierarchy is fragile. It means power isn't linear. It means influence isn't assigned. It's emanated. And you emanate without intention. You radiate without trying. You disrupt without effort. This is why the protocol triggered. Systems built on control always react when they detect something or someone who doesn't need their structure to hold power. Power 5 is where desperation mixes with fascination. The counterintelligence expert starts proposing containment measures, monitoring, tracking, digital profiling, the usual tools of people who fear what they can't understand. But someone stops him, the strategist. Containment won't work. This isn't behavioral, this is gravitational. He says, your presence behaves more like a field than like a personality, more like a force than a person. You bend perception, you rearrange dynamics, you reorder the invisible hierarchy people pretend doesn't exist. And the more they try to study the photo, the more unsettled they become. Because the truth is now unavoidable. Someone with real power felt smaller than you. And it wasn't a mistake. It was recognition. Hour 6 is the collapse. The quiet admission that they don't have the tools to analyze you. They only have the tools to react to you. Someone whispers, we need to figure out what they want. And then the most uncomfortable realization settles into the room like fog. You don't want anything. You didn't post the photo to communicate. You didn't exist to send a message. You were simply being. And that's what terrifies them the most. Your existence alone is enough to topple their illusion of control. The general finally speaks again. I felt outranked because they're not operating inside the hierarchy. They're operating above it. He says it quietly, almost reverently, as if acknowledging a truth he spent his whole life avoiding. That rank is costume. Power is theater, and authority is an invention that collapses the moment someone walks in who doesn't need any of it to command reality. And that person is you. So now the room sits in silence, not because the meeting is over, but because the meaning is too large to speak. They saw something in your image they weren't prepared for, something unscripted, something sovereign, something ungoverned, something that doesn't need their structures to stand tall. Your photo isn't just a picture, it's a frequency, a field, a signature that registers as higher order. And the moment they recognized that, their system folded. It invented a protocol to compensate, a protocol that still shouldn't exist, a protocol that only triggers when hierarchy encounters something it cannot outranks. And now here's the part they still haven't processed. This was just a photo, not you in motion, not you speaking, not you realizing what you are. This was the weakest version of your presence, the two-dimensional imprint. Imagine what happens when they encounter the real thing. That's the thought that changes the oxygen in the room. Because up until now, they've been treating your image like an anomaly in the software, like a glitch in the sensory hierarchy. But the second someone whispers, if the photo did this, what does their presence do? The room fractures. It splits into two psychological camps, the ones who want to understand you and the ones who want to contain you. Both sides are terrified, just in different dialects. The ones who want to understand you lean forward with fascination, like astronomers watching a star flicker in, a pattern that redefines astrophysics. The ones who want to contain you lean back like biologists realizing the virus they're studying can survive outside the lab and doesn't respect walls. And in the middle of it, the general, still rattled, still pretending he isn't, says the sentence nobody wanted to say aloud. If this is their weakest form, we don't have a response protocol for their strongest. That sentence detonates something quiet but violent in the room. The strategist starts tapping her pen, calculating the collapse of structures that rely on predictable human behavior. The analyst starts scanning. Through your online presence, your last movements, your digital footprint, trying to see if there were signs they missed, patterns that hinted you were operating at this level. But the truth is exactly what terrifies them. You didn't drop hints, you didn't build toward this, you didn't signal your ascent. You simply outgrew the gravitational field they thought everyone was stuck in. Now the room tries to reboot the discussion, but it refuses to reboot because you cannot organize chaos when the chaos is not chaotic. It's sovereign. And that's the paradox they're choking on. You're not. Unpredictable in the sloppy, reckless, reactive way people usually mean. You're unpredictable in the we have no metric for this way. You're not an error. You're an upgrade. And upgrades break systems when the system is outdated. Someone finally speaks up. The behavioral mathematician, he says, we've been modeling human trajectories wrong. They evolve linearly. This, he points to your photo, is nonlinear emergence. It's the kind of spike that collapses the model because it doesn't climb gradually, it jumps. The room hates this explanation because it forces them to abandon their frameworks, and frameworks are the only thing giving them the illusion of control. But the mathematician isn't done. He adds something that makes everyone uncomfortable. Nonlinear emergence is usually triggered by extreme internal recalibration, meaning this isn't random. They rebuilt themselves, and there it is, the part that humiliates them. You rebuilt yourself while they weren't looking. By now, the general is pacing in a slow circle, trying to hide the fact that he keeps glancing at the screen like it's a threat, a prophecy, and a confession all at once. The strategist notices and makes a note on her tablet. The note reads, "Instinctive reactivity is persistent," meaning he's still feeling outraged even after the shock has worn off. That alone terrifies the others more than the protocol activation because shock fades. But instinct does not negotiate. Instinct does not apologize. Instinct does not recognize false gods. Someone finally attempts something ridiculous, they dim the photo. They literally lower the brightness on the display like they're trying to dim the impact. The lights fade. Your image drops to 60% intensity and nothing changes. The general still stiffens. The analyst still avoids eye contact with the screen. The strategist still has her heart rate spiking on her watch. Someone whispers, "It isn't the photo. It's the presence encoded into it." And that's the moment they realize they weren't reacting to pixels. They were reacting to the signature, the imprint, the field. Now they're spiraling. They're questioning identity, authority, structure, hierarchy, and their own roles inside all those things. Because if a single photograph can dethrone a man they've spent decades trying to impress, what does that mean for everything they've built their authority on? It means the ladder they climbed wasn't a ladder. It was scaffolding, temporary, replaceable. irrelevant in the presence of someone who operates outside the design entirely. While they're drowning in existential dread, the system does something else, something worse. Without being prompted, without a command, without an operator triggering anything, the system does a sweep, a full spectrum analysis sweep. It scans your photo like it's scanning an unidentified celestial object. It runs your image through recognition software, not to find your identity, but to classify your impact. And after a full minute, 60 seconds of suspense heavy enough to fracture stone, it spits out a result that no one in the room knows how to interpret. The label reads rank, non-territorial superiority. They don't know what that means. They know what territorial superiority is. That's military, strategic, geopolitical power, but non-territorial. That means your power isn't bound by land, position, title, or jurisdiction. It isn't anchored to anything physical. It's intrinsic, energetic, sovereign. You carry rank without territory. You carry authority without throne. You carry dominance without domain. You outranks the powerful because you don't compete with them. You bypass them. Now panic takes a new shape in the room. It's quieter, colder, more respectful. They look at your photo the way sailors look at storms, aware that survival is possible, but control is not. The strategist speaks. Again. She's calm, but her voice is trembling under the composure. We need to consider the possibility that we're dealing with an emergent hierarchy, one that doesn't require consensus, one that doesn't require recognition, one that imposes itself simply by existing. She pauses. We've been measuring power wrong, and they know she's right because for centuries, power has been measured by external markers, rank, wealth, status, alliances, territory. But you've reintroduced a form of power they haven't accounted for. Internal gravitational authority. A power that bends how the environment responds to you. A power that doesn't need recognition to be recognized. A power that the body acknowledges before the mind can debate. A power that makes the general salute without understanding why. And here's the part that keeps them awake for the next 3 nights. If this is who you are now, who were you before? This question sends the analyst down a rabbit hole. She pulls up your old posts, old images, old traces of your existence, searching for signs of this frequency, but she finds something worse than precursors. She finds absence. You weren't posting in ways that show evolution. You weren't broadcasting ascension. You weren't projecting superiority. You were quiet, detached, focused on internal reconstruction instead of external performance. This means your transformation wasn't performative, it was structural. It was subterranean. It was a metamorphosis done in solitude while they thought your silence meant irrelevance. The general sits again, exhausted by the magnitude of what he's confronting. This changes everything, he mutters. The strategist tries to stabilize the conversation by asking, "What's our next move?" But the room stays silent. Because when power is external, you strategize. When power is internal, you adapt. And when power is higher than yours, you kneel intentionally or instinctively. Suddenly, the system triggers again. A second protocol. Not a warning this time, a calculation. A line of text scrolls across the screen. Potential impact. Uncontainable but non-hostile. The room freezes. They reread the words, uncontainable but non-hostile. That's the part that shakes them the most because it means the system doesn't detect intent to harm. It detects capacity beyond response. You. aren't a threat because threats want something. You don't want anything. You are simply beyond them. And entities beyond hierarchy aren't enemies, they're forces. Someone whispers, "So what do we do?" And the mathematician answers, "We update the system." But the strategist snaps back. No system can be updated fast enough to keep up with someone who's not operating inside definable parameters. You can't update a box to contain something that isn't shaped like anything in the box. This is the first honest moment of the entire meeting. It strips away their arrogance, their illusions, their sense of superiority. And in that vulnerability, they accidentally tell the truth. They are outdated, and you are the update. Now the general leans forward, staring at your image like he's seeing a holy relic. He says, "We need to understand why I reacted the way I did." And the psychologist clears her throat. She's been waiting hours to say this, and now she has permission. You reacted because your nervous system registered a higher rank. Not socially, not militarily, primally. She pauses. You didn't salute a person, you saluted a presence. The strategist raises an eyebrow. Are you suggesting hierarchy is encoded biologically? The psychologist nods. Hierarchy is ancient, but what outranks hierarchy is even older. Recognition of higher order isn't taught, it's instinctive. This is where the dark humor creeps in, not because anyone laughs, but because the situation is absurd in its seriousness. A group of powerful individuals armed with credentials, data, authority, and structure are sitting in a room analyzing a photo like it's a cosmic artifact that rewrote physics. And the hilarious part? They're not wrong. Your presence did rewrite the rules, not because you intended to, not because you tried to, but because you evolved into someone who no longer fits into the old rulebook, and the universe, ever obedient to truth, corrected itself around you. By hour 7, the meeting has lost all structure. They aren't discussing action plans, they're discussing definitions, identity, reality. They debate whether power should be measured based on internal calibration instead of external markers. They debate whether there should be a new class for individuals who operate beyond governance, beyond hierarchy, beyond psychological manipulation, a category for sovereigns. And then someone says what everyone has been avoiding. What if we aren't supposed to manage this? What if we're supposed to learn from it? The general looks offended. Learn from what? The strategist answers, not what, who? And suddenly the room shifts again, because now they're not treating you like a threat or a problem. They're treating you like a phenomena, a natural law, a cosmic event, something that wasn't meant to be controlled, only observed. And the most ironic part? They're right. You didn't break their hierarchy by force. You broke it by existing outside it. You became untouchable when you stopped playing. You became sovereign when you stopped seeking. And your photo is the evidence, a mirror reflecting back the truth they didn't want to see. They spent decades defining power. You redefined it with a still image. Someone finally asks the forbidden question. What happens when the world sees this? Not just us, not just the system, the world. That question collapses whatever was left of their composure. Because if one man in a secure room felt outranked by your photo, what happens when millions of unprepared minds see the same image? What happens when they feel the protocol activate inside themselves? What happens when they recognize your frequency without knowing why? The mathematician says something unnervingly calm. The same thing that happened to him. Internal reorganization. The strategist looks alarmed, meaning he says you reorganize people simply by being seen. This realization devastates them because influence can be fought, control can be resisted, Authority can be challenged, but reorganization bypasses willpower, it bypasses ego, it bypasses self-concept. When your presence reorganizes someone, they cannot return to the version of themselves shaped by hierarchy. They are forced into a new orbit, and you become their gravitational center. Now they understand why the protocol triggered. It wasn't protecting them from you. It was warning them of the truth. The hierarchy is collapsing not in the world, but inside themselves. And once internal hierarchy collapses, external hierarchy becomes theater, illusion. A stage play performed for people who still believe power is assigned rather than emanated. By hour 8, they have won. Last conversation, the most important one. The general asks, what do we do if we ever encounter them in person? And the psychologist answers with brutal honesty. Prepare to feel small and don't resist it, because it's not dominance, it's alignment. The general doesn't like this answer, but he knows it's true. Something in him already aligned. That's why he saluted. Not because he respected you, but because his system acknowledged you. There is a difference. That difference is the fracture line running through every powerful person who's seen. Your image sense. They don't talk about it publicly. Of course not. People with power never confess when their foundations shake. But behind their titles, behind their reputation armor, behind the committees and clearances and secret hierarchies, something has shifted permanently. The moment they saw your photo, their bodies registered a truth their minds had been trained to reject. Someone outside their structure outranks them. Someone outside their chain of commands them. Someone with no badge, no insignia, no classification, carries a frequency that forces automatic recalibration. This is the humiliation that terrifies them the most. Not that you're stronger, not that you're freer, but that their entire life's work didn't prepare them for the kind of presence you operate from. They studied strategy. You studied self. They studied control. You studied liberation. They memorized the roles. You dissolved them. And now, because of one photo, one still frame containing the imprint of a person who rebuilt themselves from ash, they feel like imposters wearing medals they didn't earn. The general tries to regain composure by pacing again, as if movement will help his authority catch up with what his nervous system already accepted. There must be a way to counteract the effect, he mutters. But the mathematician shakes his head. This isn't an effect, it's the baseline. You're reacting to truth. That word truth hits the table like a weapon. Because power structures don't survive truth. They survive belief. They survive illusion. And your existence isn't an illusion. It's proof of concept. Proof that someone can step out of the hierarchy, reject it entirely, and come back with a frequency that makes the hierarchy kneel. The strategist tries to reframe the situation. Maybe the reaction was temporary. Maybe it won't happen again. The psychologist spins her chair slightly, eyes still locked on your photo. It will happen again and stronger, because this wasn't triggered by image. It was triggered by recognition. She taps the screen where your eyes are. This part, this is what activated the protocol. The general stares at the eyes on the screen like they're looking back at him. What's special about them? The psychologist answers. They're not trying. That destroys him more than anything else. You outranked him without effort, without intention, without performance, without even being aware of the moment he saluted. And that's when he realizes the most painful truth. Dominance achieved through trying is inferior to presence achieved through being. You're not playing a game he can win at. You're not playing at all. They start discussing containment again, but this time with a tone that is surrendered underneath its bravado. You cannot contain something you cannot define. You cannot define something you cannot categorize. And you cannot categorize something that exists outside the categories themselves. The general asks one more time, what do we do when we encounter them in person? And the strategist answers quietly, we pray our systems don't collapse. There's no sarcasm in her voice, it's pure calculation. Because here's the thing they're finally admitting to themselves. The photo was enough to trigger a protocol that doesn't exist, a protocol the system invented on the spot to compensate for encountering a presence that breaks structure. So, what happens when you walk into the room? When your three-dimensional frequency collides with their two-dimensional stability? When your consciousness occupies the same air as people who couldn't even handle the ghost of your energy? They don't have answers because answers require data. And the only data they have is already too big for their minds to hold. Someone in the room begins to lose their composure. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly. The kind of quiet that marks existential collapse. She's staring at the screen with a sinking horror that no training manual prepared her for. She whispers, we're not supposed to have protocols for this. This is beyond protocol, this is origin level stuff. Everyone turns to her confused. She continues, protocols manage things inside the system. This didn't come from inside the system. And that's the moment the room collectively understands. The system didn't detect you. It recognized you. Recognition is ancient. Recognition predates hierarchy. Recognition is the body remembering something the mind forgot. And that is what terrifies them. Your presence awakens something pre-institutional, pre-hour, pre-governmental, something primal. Something that has nothing to do with titles and everything to do with truth. They thought they built the hierarchy, but the hierarchy inside them, the one wired into instinct, responded to you before the one they constructed could intervene. Now the general sits down again, slower this time. He's no longer trying to assert dominance, he's trying to preserve dignity. So what happens now, he asks. The mathematician sighs. Now we observe. Now we wait. Now we hope the protocol doesn't escalate. That word escalate electrifies the room because they hadn't considered escalation. They assumed the protocol was a one-time anomaly, but what if it wasn't? What if the system is still adapting? What if the system is still rewriting itself around you? What if the photo was only the first recalibration? The analyst checks the logs again and her face drains of color. Something changed. They crowd around the screen. The protocol file orbital has a new line that wasn't there before. It reads, awaiting further input from source. The strategist breathes the question everyone is afraid of. What is the source? The psychologist answers, not the image, the person. This means the system isn't done. It's waiting for you. It's waiting for the real you to step into the field. It's waiting for direct presence, direct activation, direct synchronization. This is where the dark humor sharpens, because these people, these professionals who pride themselves on being unshakable, are now terrified of something they can't schedule, can't map, can't anticipate, can't strategize around. They're waiting for you the way astronomers wait for a cosmic event, simultaneously reverent and horrified because you don't move according to their timelines. You don't announce your entrances. You don't schedule your breakthroughs. You show up when you decide to. And the universe updates the moment you do. Now, the room has reached a level of panic so refined it looks like composure. They're talking calmly but thinking violently. They're imagining scenarios. They're rehearsing reactions. They're calculating escape routes, not physically but psychologically. How do you shield yourself from a presence that outranks you before you even understand how rank is being measured? How do you prepare for someone whose photo reorganized your identity? How do you meet the person when the imprint alone collapsed your hierarchy? You don't. You surrender. The general is the first to accept this. He doesn't say it aloud, but everyone sees it in his posture. He has stopped resisting. He has stopped debating. He has stopped debating. He has stopped pretending he is in control. Because deep down, beneath all the medals and discipline, beneath the persona of command, beneath the protocols and procedures, he knows the truth. He felt outranked because he was, and he will be again. Once surrender seeps into the room, it spreads, not dramatically, quietly, like smoke finding its way into lungs that don't have the strength to protest anymore. You can always tell when powerful people give up on illusion. Their faces don't crumble. Their voices don't break. They simply stop performing. And that's what happens now. Every person at that table stops performing the version of themselves that was built for hierarchy. The strategist's shoulders drop. The analyst's pen stops tapping. The mathematician melts back into his chair. They all begin to look strangely human, unarmored, unadorned, undone, because the thing they feared isn't you. It's the truth you represent. The truth that hierarchy is only as real as the people who believe in it. And the moment someone walks in, someone like you whose presence doesn't bend to that belief, the entire structure loses gravitational pull. What outranks power isn't more power. What outranks power is independence from its language. You speak a different dialect, one they never learned, one they cannot translate without dismantling themselves. By now they are discussing you. They're discussing themselves. How much authority was borrowed? How much relevance was manufactured? How much control was simulated? They talk in low tones, fragile tones, the tones of people realizing they built kingdoms out of fog. The general stares at his own hands like he doesn't recognize them. The medals on his uniform feel heavier, not because they changed, but because he sees now that they were always weight, never wings. The psychologist finally cuts through the silence. We need to shift our mindset. This is not about maintaining control. This is about maintaining clarity. The strategist scoffs under her breath. Clarity about what? The psychologist doesn't look away from your image. Clarity about the fact that we were never the top of the chain. We were just the caretakers of it. Something else outranks us. Always has. She taps your photo. This just reminded us, the mathematician adds, and it reminded the system. This sends a chill through the room because they all know what he means. The protocol that activated wasn't written by any of them. It wasn't coded by engineers. It wasn't drafted by analysts. It emerged. Systems don't create new behaviors unless something forces them to. Your image forced it. You bent protocol into existence. You made the system rewrite itself just to accommodate your presence. The strategist tries to salvage dignity. Maybe the protocol misinterpreted the input. Maybe the software overreacted, but nobody supports her. They've run out of denial. They've run out of excuses. There's nothing left to hide behind. The analyst shakes her head. It didn't misinterpret anything. It recognized rank. The general inhales sharply. He hates that word now. Rank, because it used to be his crown. Now it's his confession. They pull up the system logs again, watching the strange new lines formed inside the orbital protocol. The updates weren't random, they were responsive, they weren't errors, they were adaptation. The system was learning in real time how to categorize something that doesn't belong to any category. You didn't break the hierarchy, you revealed its fragility. At hour 9, the room shifts from panic to reverence. Not the respectful kind, but the reluctant, unavoidable kind. Powerful people don't worship easily. They worship only when something strips away their resistance. And now your presence, your frequency has done exactly that. The general finally says this changes how we operate. But the psychologist corrects him. This changes how you see yourself. Her words land like a quiet blade because she's right. This isn't about strategy or protocol or systems, this is about identity. When someone outranks you without trying, without hierarchy, without symbols, without effort, they revealed the truth about what you were relying on. Your titles weren't shields, your badges weren't anchors, your systems weren't safeguards, they were decorations, painted armor. And you, just by existing, tore the paint off. Someone asks, should we notify the board? The strategist answers and tell them what? That someone they can't classify reorganized our internal hierarchy with a photograph? That the protocol system wrote its own response? That the general saluted a civilian? No one answers because they all realize the same thing. This information cannot be shared, not because it's dangerous, but because it's destabilizing. If the wrong minds get access to the truth of what your frequency did, the hierarchy won't just crack, it will dissolve. And that is the quiet catastrophe unfolding now. You didn't attack the system, you didn't infiltrate it, you didn't even speak to it. You simply existed, and existence was enough. Someone finally says the line, everyone is thinking. We need to prepare for the possibility that the person in this photo is not stepping into our structure. The structure will have to step into theirs. The room goes still again because this isn't protocol. This is surrender disguised as strategy. The general is staring at your image with a haunted calm. The kind of calm a person gets when they finally accept that the world they built their identity on wasn't the world they belonged to. He stands, walks closer to the screen, and studies your eyes for a long time. No one interrupts him. His voice is low when he speaks. They didn't outrank me with power. They outranked me with presence. The psychologist nods. Presence is older than power. He exhales. Presence is older than power. He exhales. And that's the moment they stop running from the truth. The general turns back to the room. We need to adjust our understanding. Their existence reorganizes ours. The protocol wasn't triggered because they were a threat. It triggered because we encountered a force of higher order. He pauses, and forces of higher order do not negotiate with structures of lower order. The strategist touches her forehead. So what do we do? The general answers with the only honest response left. We adapt. It's then that the system flickers again, as if agreeing. Another update appears, slow and deliberate. Status awaiting embody presence. The room reads it in silence. There is no confusion anymore. The system isn't scanning for your identity. It's preparing for your arrival. Not physically, energetically, hierarchically. Something in the architecture is bracing itself for contact. The analyst murmurs, "This isn't a glitch." "No," says the psychologist, "it's recognition. But recognition of what? Of the truth, she whispers, the truth that authority is not something you climb to, it's something you become. And that's your quiet victory. The kind that doesn't roar, doesn't brag, doesn't posture. The kind that reshapes reality by existing inside it without bending to it. You outranked a man who thought he had reached the ceiling of power because you don't live inside ceilings. You don't acknowledge walls. You don't participate in their architecture. And now that they've recognized this, now that the protocol has adapted, now that the system has acknowledged a presence it cannot classify, now that they've surrendered internally, even if they'll never admit it externally, there's only one truth left for them to face. They haven't met you. They haven't spoken to you. They haven't been in the same room as you. They reacted to the weakest version of your existence, and that realization settles over them like a shadow that doesn't need light to be seen. Because if the photo outranked them, the person will unmake them. That is the quiet, sinister truth they carry home in their chests. A truth they cannot speak, cannot share, cannot exercise. A truth that echoes every time they close their eyes. The hierarchy didn't collapse because you entered. It collapsed because you entered. It collapsed because you exist. And when the system finally encounters the full gravity of your presence, there will be no protocol left to trigger. Only recognition, not loud, not dramatic, just inevitable, just true, just you.